This is number 74 in chapter 4. It's looking at being able to predict whether a particular solute is soluble or not in water. These are ionic solutes, and so remember we have some rules that we need to know. We're basically looking at precipitation reactions. Being able to predict whether we have a precipitate or not. Here we're not writing the reaction, we're just simply looking at an ionic solid and determining whether it is soluble or not in water. And so here we have silver iodide. Silver iodide contains a halide. Halides are soluble, but there are exceptions to the halides, and this is one of them. Silver is an exception to solubility with halides. Other transition metals are too, lead and mercury as well. So I think trying to remember that some of these transition metals are exceptions to the rule is a good idea, especially with halides. Part B, so this, this would be insoluble as a result. Part B is looking at a copper phosphate. This would be a cupric phosphate. And so if we look at our table, phosphates are generally insoluble. And copper, again, is a transition metal. And those tend to be exceptions, but really more of an exception to a solubility rule as opposed to an insolubility rule. And so as a result, this guy is also insoluble in water. Part C looks at cobalt carbonate or cobalt 2 carbonate. If we look at carbonates, carbonates are like phosphates in that they tend to be insoluble. The only exception to this rule is really these group 1A and 2A metals. And just like with part B, we have a transition metal with the cobalt, so we have no help there. So this again would be insoluble, just as part B was insoluble. Part D looks at potassium phosphate, and we've already looked at phosphate. Phosphate we determined in part B to be insoluble. But again, one of the exceptions to the rules, or really the major exception to the rule for phosphates, and likewise carbonates, is this idea of group 1 and group 2A metals being so incredibly soluble. And so as a result of having an ion that's very soluble, this guy will dissolve in water. And so it will dissolve. So with all of these, you really have to look at both ions. You have to look at the metal cation, you have to look at the non-metal anion, and again, think about that table as far as being able to predict solubility or insolubility. Notice that I started with all of these by looking at the anion, and first ascertaining whether the anion was soluble or not. And then I went to the metal to see if it was really a transition metal, in which case there's usually no help. We might find it as an exception, such as part A. We also might find an exception, as in part D, with that group 1A metal, now making phosphate soluble. That is number 74.